Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 43-44. Chapter 43. Takeout. Solaire's body crashed through a tree, shattering the oak trunk and sending splinters shooting off in all directions. His body continued to ragdoll through the air before burying itself into the ground. Lucian jumped away from a similar strike, the glowing blade batting the Kirkhammer upwards and sending him stumbling backwards. Ludwig let out a screech and made to press the assault. Then Goff slammed an arrow into his side. Using the elongated projectile as a melee weapon, he ripped the serrated head sideways, tearing a large chunk of flesh out of Ludwig's body. The beast let loose a scream of agony which quickly shifted into a snarl of aggression as it began slashing the moonlight greatsword towards him. Goff made to leap back, far too slowly to avoid the attack in full as it cuts its way across his chest, effortlessly cutting through his steel armor. Goff rolled backwards as blood spilled from the wound, his uninjured arm pressing into the gash to stem the flow. Ludwig growled, clasping the arrow stuck in his body and tearing it free, cocking his arm back and holding the weapon like a javelin. Goff widened his eyes behind his helmet in realization and made an attempt to move far too late as Ludwig hurled the arrow towards him at breakneck speeds. The arrow speared through his shoulder, sending him reeling backwards with a cry of pain. The beast was unable to take advantage of the attack before Lucian slammed his grandorder into his back leg. The snapping of bone as his ankle bent inwards heralded a cry of pain. Ludwig whirled around, the moonlight greatsword carving a line through the dirt as it arced upwards towards the hunter. Lucian jumped back, barely seeing his distorted reflection mirrored in the surface of the blade as it passed a hair's breadth from the front of his face. His left hand snapped upwards, pistol clasped tightly in it as he quickly took aim at Ludwig's shoulder. Squeezing the trigger, the quicksilver bullet shot through the air, tearing a small hole through the beast's shoulder. Ludwig growled and responded, raising his sword into the air before he pointed it downwards. Lucian jumped back as Ludwig stabbed the sword into the ground, the area around him briefly lighting up in a pale blue color before it exploded, sending a shockwave of energy blasting out in a radius around him. The blue energy slammed into Solaire's shield, sending him skating backwards slightly but failing to knock him over. However, he suspected that had he been closer it would have been a different story. Solaire shot forwards, shattering the ground beneath his feet as he rocketed towards Ludwig. The glazed-over eyes of the beast caught sight of him as he rapidly approached, quickly ripping his sword free from the ground and swinging it towards the Sun Knight. Raising his shield above his head, Solaire heard the scraping of metal as the sword was barely deflected over the top of him as he continued his charge. Pulling back his sword arm, he thrust the straight sword forwards, burying it to the hilt in Ludwig's front right leg beneath the second joint in the leg. Before Ludwig could attempt to strike again, Solaire twisted the blade and wrenched it to the side. The deep popping sound heralded the joint becoming dislocated. Ludwig grunted in point, falling over and extending one of his spare legs to take up the slack of the now ruined limb. Raising his shield above his head, Solaire blocked the heavy punch that Ludwig directed towards him, the clawed fingers slamming into the shield like a hammer. Solaire felt his bones protest against the strike as Ludwig reeled back his arm a second time. As the fist approached, Solaire struck first. Swiping his shield to the side, he slammed the metal disc into Ludwig's fist, parrying it to the side before slicing upwards towards his wrist. Ludwig wrenched his hand back, causing Solaire's blade to claim only a single finger rather than the whole hand. The index digit dropped to the ground with a quiet thud. Ludwig screamed in a mixture of agony and rage. Clasping his greatsword with two hands, he brought it back like a baseball bat, glassy eyes fixed on Solaire. The knight leapt away in an effort to avoid the strike, raising his shield just in case. The glowing blue blade glided through the air, slamming into Solaire's shield and effortlessly cleaving through it. Solaire let out a bloodied cough as the blue blade carved its way through his chest and sent him rocketing away into the distance, ragdolling through the nearby tents before coming to a halt. Lucian watched the knight get punted with a sour expression, quickly turning his head back to Ludwig and raising his grandorder again. Ludwig span around to face him in an instant. He ducked down fast enough to avoid the strike that had been launched against him, barely feeling the wisp of wing pass above the back of his neck where the moonlight greatsword barely avoided decapitating him. Kicking himself forwards, Lucian launched himself beneath Ludwig, swinging the Kirkhammer upwards into their ribs. The rock hammer made contact with a heavy thud. Spinning around, Lucian proceeded to slam the hammer into the back of the nearest leg. The ground beneath Ludwig glowed brightly. Lucian charged out of the circle of light just before the moonlight greatsword was stabbed into the ground, the shockwave of the explosion knocking him through the air before he hit the ground in a roll, quickly getting back to his feet. He widened his eyes, raising the hammer above his head just in time to block the downward strike of the blade. He felt his knees hit the ground and his arms start to protest under the power of the strike, Ludwig's face looming over him menacingly as they continued to push down with all their might. Lucian felt his arms start to groan as inch by inch, the edge of the glowing blue blade came closer and closer to his face. A blue blur crashed into Ludwig's side, the beast stumbled slightly which allowed for Lucian to dive away from the blade. He stood up to see the copy of Ash stood near the beast, bastard sword pointed towards it with 2 hands. He looked over his shoulder just in time to see the woman shuffling over to where Solaire had been launched, likely to provide healing arts to him. He only had to ensure that she had enough time to do so. Throwing the Kirkhammer away, he thrust his hand into the ground as it turned slightly murky. His hand grasping the handle of a long silver greatsword and slowly pulling it out of the ground. He gripped it in 2 hands, holding the flat of the blade in front of his face with the tip pointed upwards. Closing his eyes, he sent a mental command through the sword. Seconds later, the blade erupted in a brilliant blue light. Ludwig's head snapped towards him in an instant, the eyes widened slightly as it took sight of the sword now held in the hunter's hand. Then slowly trailed down to the sword held in its own hands, darting between the 2 identical glowing blades. Twirling the blade in his hands, Lucian left a trail of blue light as the sword glided through the air before coming to a rest on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked up towards the beast. The wordless challenge was issued. Ludwig charged. Master's Pav. The flat of Ash's blade was brought up just in time to block the beam of red energy. The unkindled released a grunt as the power behind the attack knocked him off his feet and sent him blasting through the air and crashing through the outer wall of the forum, sailing through the air and colliding with the nearest building outside. Beams of red light danced across the room as the servants attempted to file out of the cramped conditions. Arash knocked several arrows, loosening them towards Aldrich's head. The central eyes moving up the flesh pillar glowed and as a red shield manifested in front of the saint, blocking the arrows. Arash clicked his tongue, throwing himself into a roll as the space he was in was vaporized in a burst of flames. The Dragon Slayer armor slammed its shield into the ground in front of Mash, who was desperately attempting to drag Vrindari away as they made for the entrance of the door. His detached limb still lying in the ground where it had fallen. A burst lance of energy carved itself along the berserker's helmet, melting the leftmost side of it. The armor released a groan as it continued to use its body as a shield for the others. Leaving so soon? Aldrich mocked. You just arrived. Why not stay a while? He jerked his right hand upwards. A pillar of flesh shot out of the ground in front of him, taking the brunt of a comet of blue light courtesy of Gwyndolin. The Lord glaring at Aldrich from behind his helmet as he dismissed his staff and readied his bow. The eyes trailing up the pillar slowly regenerated, instantly fixing their gaze upon the Lord, their cross-shaped pupils narrowed as the Lord felt the air around him change. He disappeared in a burst of light seconds later, just avoid the pillar of fire which erupted from the spot where he had stood. What the hell is he? Ritska panic shouted as he leapt out of the room, Beatrice following after him while shooting off soul spears at the saint, for all the good they did. The spells being deflected or blocked with ease. I don't know. Olga exclaimed back at him, her eyes wide and frantic as she shot a glance of her shoulder. Ash said Lev was a demon but I didn't think this would happen. Most demons aren't even supposed to be that powerful. It can be discussed later. Nero cut them off, although she similarly had sweat trailing down her brow. We must first deal with him. The wall on the right-hand side exploded outwards, Sif being launched through the air with a hideous burn across his right side as he cluttered across the ground in a heap. Gareth smacking into the ground face first not too far from him, quickly looking up and catching sight of her wounded mount, Sif. She span around as the tentacle burst through the wall she had been launched out of, glaring down at her before unleashing a barrage of spells towards her. Gareth jumped around, dodging them with some effort as they destroyed the street. Mash jumped in front of the pair of masters, blocking a stray bolt of power with a grunt. Vrindari. Ritska called out to the Steel Knight, gaping at the missing arm, oh god. Why your arm? Worry about it later. Vrindari gave a pained shout in reply, slowly rising to his feet and hefting his mirror shield out in front of him. I can still defend you, my liege. That is all that is needed. Be but your arm. Servants are being comprised of magical energy. Olga shouted at him, attempting to sound more composed than she actually was. Given enough time it will eventually heal. Oh, Ritska let out a sigh of relief. All right, but talk later. Ash's voice cried out as the black fireball hurtled above their heads, crashing into the center of the tentacle of flesh and burnt away a large portion of its central body. Where's Gwyndolin? Still inside with Berserker. Olga called back to him, I'll try and get Berserker. A flash of red accompanied by an explosion was soon followed by the form of the Dragon Slayer armor sent skating out of the doorway, portions of its armor singled and streams of burn marks running up its shield. The armor let out a menacing groan as Gwyndolin soon formed next to them, his face set in a frown. This is far stronger than I recall Aldrich being. He consumed the demon Lev. Ash informed him, dropping down next to the group, but I know of few demons that could even grant this level of power. The front of the forum shattered, debris being sent flying in all directions as Aldrich came barreling outside. The river of sludge trailing behind him soon flooded the street as he towered over the group. The tentacles adorned with the glowing red eyes soon followed after him, each one glowing brightly as they stared the group down. Aldrich stared down at them impassively, then slowly began to spread his arms wide. Your escape from the structure was unfortunate, but it is of little consequence. Mobility will provide you with no advantage. That remains to be seen. Gareth shot back at him, kite shield in front of her as Sif gradually attempted to get back to their feet. Aldrich spared her barely a glance in response. The tentacle to his left turned, the eyes running up its body focused in on them. They then widened, a wave of black fog exploded out from the sludge, instantly rushing towards the group. Mash widened her eyes in alarm, thrusting her shield forwards. Lord Chaldea's. The shield glowed a brilliant blue as it soon enveloped the masters in a protective barrier. The others were less fortunate. Ash speared his sword into the ground as the cloud slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave. Instantly he felt pain assail his whole body, and if the cries of pain were any indication, he was not the only one to feel this way. Arash leapt out of the street, hooking an arm under Beatrice just before the cloud hit, soaring through the sky before he landed down on the roof of a nearby house, laying Beatrice down and spinning around to face Aldrich. Knocking 2 arrows and launching them towards the nearest tentacle. The projectiles gored through the meat pillars, instantly puncturing through their bodies and leaving gaping holes going straight through them. If it affected Aldrich in any way, he didn't show it. Merely raising her arms and then clenching them around his chest with a smirk. The center of Aldrich's torso began to glow an insidious orange as a right hand slowly pushed its way out of him. The limb continued to extend out of his body, stretching on for far longer than was natural. Naive. Very naive. Aldrich cackled, the limb twirled above his head as the hand opened up before it shot forwards. Stolen phantasm. Zabania. Ash looked up just in time for the red hand to run itself along his chest. He snarled, batting it away from his body and jumping into the air. Pulling back his left hand and readying a pyromancy. Arash's clairvoyance kicked in, he widened his eyes in alarm and instantly took aim towards the red limb. Far too late to act. The hand retracted until it was in front of Aldrich's grinning face. Resting in its palm was a transparent image of a heart. The hand clenched downwards around the beating organ. Ash instantly constricted his body, coughing out blood and clasping over the area of his heart as he crashed into the ground, sword falling from his hand and burying itself in the ground. Mash barely caught sight of him as the cloud dissipated, widened her eyes as she saw his writhing form, Ash-san. Arash's arrows struck the arm seconds later. Aldrich released a hiss of pain as the power behind them obliterated the palm of the arm. He scowled at the archer before drawing the hand back into his body. Zabania. Olga choked, but that's a noble phantasm of the Hassan. How did you think that with the Grail in my possession I would not partake in discovering new abilities to usurp? The saint scoffed, there were many servants I partook in. And not simply limited to assassins. A manic grin came across his face as his eyes drifted over to Nero. You claim to be an emperor. Then feel the power of your predecessors. He clasped his hands together, slowly pulling them apart as a weapon started to take shape. It had all the hallmarks of being a spear, were it not for the fact that both ends appeared to be chiseled out of blood-red stone. Gripping the handle of the spear, he thrust it upwards towards the sky, stolen phantasm. The ground beneath the group began to violently rumble. Vrindari groaned as he marched to the front of the group. Sensing trouble. Provis voluis corruptus. Vrindari thrust his shield forwards as the street exploded upwards in a scattering of tiles and dirt. Spegelheimer. The mirror of his shield expanded, soon forming a thin reflective barrier which barely protected the masters behind him. The darkened tree formed of bramble violently thrashed around as it burst from the ground, the branches spearing through nearby buildings and attempting to breach the barrier. The weight of the tree fell upon Vrindari's shield. The knight buckled slightly, gritting his teeth in effort. The dirt under his feet began to sink downwards as he was gradually pushed back. This sword is. Ash coughed out a mouthful of blood, slowly pushing himself to his feet. The abyss itself, he ran his hand across the onyx blade and causing it to catch fire, bringing it under his left arm and hunching his body forwards. The dark soul of man, Clea Arg. He was cut off when several branched of the bramble skewered his body, wrapping tightly around him as they began to cut deeply into his limbs. Even with his senses mostly dulled, it was quite the experience of pain for him. Ash. Ritska called out in alarm. By the reinforce my attack. Ash called through the mental link. I can clear away the tree, do it. Ritska grit his teeth before nodding his head, activating his mystic code and thrusting his hand towards Ash. Momentary reinforcement. Ash felt a rush of power through his limbs, pushing himself through the dried branch and snapping several in the process. The dark soul of man clears all away. Sweeping the burning blade in front of him, he released a wave of black fire towards the tree. Elfried. The abyssal fire spread across the branches, greedily consuming the perverted tree. Aldrich watched with a scowl, raising his hand to command the pillars again when he was struck with a burst of arrows. Throwing up one of the pillars to act as a shield, he glared in the direction of Gwyndolin as the god prepared another salvo. You Arg. Aldrich reeled back, snarling in agony as his eyes turned downwards to see the giant axe of the berserker buried in his central pillar. Begone. He swept his arm across the air, the tentacles behind him flashed with light before they unleashed a barrage of spells, strafing the entire road upwards. A red blur shot out of the clouds. Nero dashed through the air, face set in a fierce expression as she brought her burning sword down on the nearest tentacle. The red blade was buried down to its hilt. With a cry of effort she dragged the weapon downwards, opening up the tentacle with the mysterious fire which clung to the blade. Aldrich snarled, thrusting his hand towards her and launching several pillars at her. Nero ducked and weaved as they slammed into the ground, sending waves of the sludge in all directions as they attempted to grab her. The crimson lance in Aldrich's hands disappeared, soon replaced by an elongated staff with an exaggerated blade made of bone. The tip of the spear glowed a brilliant purple as the saint waved it through the air, leaving behind a trail of glowing orbs which soon began to rain down upon the street. Ash staggered behind Mash's shield as the group hid in an alleyway, falling onto his back before Vrindari dragged him along with his single arm. Ash. Ritska was at his side instantly. How bad? He crushed my heart. Ash coughed out, then gestured to the multiple lacerations lining his torn armor. And I am not in the best of condition, I am afraid. I am regretting my lack of Estus. Your spirit core has been destroyed and you're still here. Olga gaped at him. Ash shook his head. The few benefits of being undead. He released a bloodied mirthless chuckle. My spirit core, as you describe it, resides in my head. It is not the first time my heart has been run through. So you can recover. Not immediately, I am afraid. Letting out another cough, he spat out a mouthful of blood onto the street. Even my healing pyromancies will take some time. Your mystic code has healing spells on them. Olga snapped at Ritska. Get him on his feet while your other servants do what they can with Aldrich. We need every available hand here. Her head snapped to Vrindari. If any more become grievously wounded, can you protect them? I will overlook this instance of you issuing me commands. Vrindari gruffly replied as he manifested his mirror shield again. But yes, should any more become too injured to fight, I will do all I can to protect them until they can move again. All right. Olga let out a sigh of relief as she peeked her head around the corner. Just hope it's enough. The tentacle swept through the air, colliding with the midsection of the Dragonslayer armor and knocking the suit off its feet. The hunk of metal was flung through the air before it slammed into the ground with a heavy thud. Several soul spears slammed into the tentacle as Beatrice continued to jump around, desperately avoiding the return fire from the saint. Her face awash with panic as a beam of energy lanced just by her head. Ducking down, the tentacle shot just over her head and smashed through the building behind her. Spinning around, she swung her catalyst upwards as a glowing sword manifested around the staff, slashing into the red eye which glared down at her. It took all of a second for the eye to regenerate itself and narrow at her immediately. A dozen arrows slammed into it, destroying a large section before it could unleash its spells upon her. Beatrice's eyes caught the blur of Arash leaping through the air as he continued to harass the tentacles, continually loosening dozens of arrows at a time. Pest! Aldrich roared at the archer, thrusting his arm forwards and firing off a wave of spells towards the man. Arash widened his eyes as he leapt off the building he had been crouched on. Moments before the barrage struck it and virtually erased the building from existence, Burning's remains of brick and tile were blasted across the battlefield in a buckshot of debris. Aldrich gripped the speared catalyst with both his hands as he turned his attention to Gwyndolin, sweeping the spear through the air and unleashing a single projectile of brilliant violet towards the Lord. Gwyndolin unleashed an azure copy towards it as the two collided with each other, resulting in an explosion of magic. I see your power was not exaggerated, Lord Gwyndolin. Aldrich mocked with a sneer. As grateful as I am to Sullivan for removing you as an obstacle, a small part of me was saddened that I lost the opportunity to prove my superiority over you. These should show the deceiver far more courtesy than simple thanks. Gwyndolin replied, the corner of his lip twitched upwards, he prevented thee from experiencing a humiliating death. Aldrich's expression flattened out as his eyes narrowed, bold words indeed. But it is not I who currently flees for my life. Thou art unused to combat. Gwyndolin waved his hand, disappeared in a burst of light. Aldrich felt pain lance across his back moments later as he reeled forwards. A snarl made its way onto his face as he span around swinging his staff and unleashing another beam of light behind him. The attack obliterated the empty building. When dealing with the simple-minded, simple tactics are most effective. Another wave of soul arrows rained down on him. The saint raised a pillar above his head to block them before he snapped his eyes back down to the street. Gwyndolin stood in the center of the ruined market. And thee are the most simple of all. The deceiver achieved my death through his own hands, thou art carrion. No more than some common rat, he disappeared in another burst of light as the spot he was standing on became consumed in fire. Good for kindling and not else. You dare. Aldrich roared in fury as he drew the staff into the air again, only for a red blur to slam into his side. Nero slashed her burning sword upwards as she shot past the saint, slicing through his right arm below the elbow. Aldrich hissed as the limb fell from his body, the catalyst falling with it. Dozens of red eyes locked onto the Emperor in an instant, all burning with unspoken levels of rage. Arash! Go for his head! Ritska called through the mental link as he peered out from his hiding spot. Arash gave a brief acknowledgement as he knocked a single arrow, pulled it back and took aim towards Aldrich's puppet body. Aldrich reeled back as an arrow slammed into his skull, puncturing through his left eye and appearing out the back of his head. He screamed, remaining gripping at the shaft buried in his face. His remaining eye instantly locked onto the archer, who had the gall to crack a smirk and give him a small wave before he instantly schooled his features and knocked another arrow. Raising his remaining arm, Aldrich made to thrust it forwards when he felt himself topple forwards. His eyes trailed down to see Sif blur past him, the dark greatsword in his mouth splitting open his central pillar of support. Time moved into slow motion for him as he saw the small blonde knight with the giant lance rush towards the now open wound in his body. She thrust the giant spear into the hole, the explosion of magical energy followed moments later. Gareth sprinted away as the wound turned into a gaping hole running all the way through Aldrich's body. Arash's arrow slammed into his left side, obliterating his shoulder and sending the limb hurtling behind him. With a mental command, he desperately attempted to raise the remaining tentacles to act as his shield. The Dragon Slayer armor buried its large axe into the nearest pillar, splitting it in half horizontally and leaving a gap in his defenses. Aldrich's eyes constricted in fury. Incineration ritual. He cried out, his voice a mix of desperation and rage at the fact that he had been pushed back so far. He was splitting his energy between maintaining the barrier and attempting to regenerate himself. He mentally clicked his tongue. It was a gamble, but if he died here then everything would have been for nothing. With the sound of shattering glass, the dome around them broke down as Aldrich felt power once again flood his body. His remaining pillars positively hummed in power as he finished coursing the magical energy through them. Flauros. The street exploded in pillars of light. Sullivan Pav. He heard the sound of shattering glass moments before he heard the explosion. He cut down the final hollow before him before snapping his attention over to the direction of the commotion. He watched as the barrier which had surrounded the forum collapsed, soon followed by the explosion of light. It seems Aldrich is becoming desperate. He mused, if he was being honest, he would have expected this outcome to occur far earlier. He would have frowned if he had lips. Perhaps he has consumed more powerful figures. It would make sense. Casting a final glance over the street, he turned his body towards the explosion. Mentally debating something in his mind. The Chaos Witch and Burning Golem were still moving through the streets, clearing up the remaining pockets of resistance. He had no true desire to face Aldrich in combat. Whether or not he was more skilled than the Saint was a moot point. Aldrich always did have power to his advantage. A rumble echoed across the city from above. Casting his sight upwards, Sullivan saw the vortex begin to glow with a deep blue. Then he felt something impact against his skin. He blinked, then hissed as he felt the subtle burn from it, flicking his hand to his face and brushing it away. He stared down at the black liquid he had swatted from his person as it hit the ground. Abyss. He muttered under his breath in shock, head darting back up to the clouds. It's going to rain abyss. He snapped his head back to the direction of Aldrich. The choice of whether or not to intervene had been taken out of his hands. Servants versus Ludwig Pav. The two glowing blades danced across the battlefield. The ethereal glow each produced exploded outwards with each clash. Ludwig was a whirlwind, having found some fresh form of vigor as he ruthlessly advanced on the hunter. Ludwig swung the blade downwards, smashing it into the ground as Lucian rolled away from the strike. Spinning around, he thrust the blade towards Ludwig's wrist. The beast twisted the blade in the ground, tearing it free and sending a show of dirt into the hunter's face. Lucian growled in annoyance as he bat the debris aside, only for the glowing blade of Ludwig to come flying through the rain of dirt towards him. Where it clashed with the bastard sword of the copy of Ash. The clone's knees buckled under the weight of the blow but did not break under it. Lucian used the opportunity for what it was. He threw himself forwards, jumping over the blade and rushing straight for Ludwig's chest. Glazed eyes locked onto his form. Within a split second Ludwig hefted his blade into the air, throwing the clone of Ash away and punched downwards with his free hand towards the hunter. Spinning to a halt, Lucian held his sword up so the edge was pointed towards the oncoming punch. The ethereal sword effortlessly cut through Ludwig's fist, his own momentum carrying the forearm further and further along the edge of the sword as it was split down the middle all the way up to his elbow. Ludwig's cry of pain was cut short when a bolt of lightning struck his right cheek. The beast staggered with the blow, pulling the remains of its arm back before it locked onto the form of Solaire. Cecilia stood just behind him with the subtle glow surrounding the two begin to fade away. My thanks, Lady Cecilia. Solaire nodded to her, the exposed skin across his chest from the strike healing over until it was pristine. Thou art most welcome. The woman bowed her head to him before casting her eyes over to Goff. I shall provide aid unto Sir Goff. I will ensure no harm comes to you in that time. The knight replied as he strode towards Ludwig, that is my promise to you, as true as the sun shines above my head. He gripped his straight sword with two hands, twisting his body as he held the blade up so it was running parallel to his cheek. Ludwig let out a howl as Lucian slashed upwards through the front of his body, the blade carved up his midsection before being wrenched free. The beast recoiled away from the hunter, waving the sword through the air and unleashing arcs of brilliant blue light towards the man. Lucian ducked and rolled in between them, the ground becoming scorched as they impacted behind the hunter. Solaire disappeared in a burst of speed before he reappeared in the air above Ludwig, sword pointed downwards as he descended. Ludwig looked up just in time for the knight to plant the tip of his blade in their elongated forehead. Thrashing their head around wildly, Solaire attempted to push the sword in deeper before he caught sight of a flash of blue in the corner of his eye. He kicked off of Ludwig's skull, sending his head snapping to the side with the force of the jump just as the moonlight greatsword passed just above his face. Flipping through the air, the Sun Knight landed on the ground next to Lucian. The hunter gave him a quirk of his eyebrow before turning his attention back to Ludwig. Not bad, didn't go deep enough. Quite so. Solaire nodded his head, he has quite the thick skull. Where's the woman off to? Healing Esser Goff. The giant. HMPH. Lucian grunted in response, he's not much good in this type of close fight, but better than nothing. Thou shalt be up soon, Esser Goff. Cecilia assured him, casting a quick glance over her shoulder as Solaire and Lucian rushed Ludwig together. Turning back to the giant, she held her hands out in front of her as the subtle golden glow surrounded his body. Healing miracles, milady Cecilia. Goff coughed out as he sat up, hand going to the arrow buried in his shoulder. Resting his hand on the shaft of the arrow, he took in a sharp take of breath before ripping it free from his body. A low hiss of pain followed. Apologies, thou may find thyself busy for some time. 'Tis no issue. Cecilia dismissed instantly, head flicking back over to where Solaire and Lucian were. Thy help is required. I know. He grunted, heal my shoulder. Lowering his body closer to her, he presented the wound. As long as I can loosen my arrows, 'tis more than enough. Cecilia nodded her head, shifting her focus over to the wound. Master's Pav. The smoke began to clear as the ruins of the street were unveiled. Masha's cross-shaped shield was placed protectively in front of Nero, the Emperor releasing a hiss as she firmly pressed her hand onto the burn on her right side. Her normally tied-up hair was loose, freely fluttering in the wind. Vrindari was panting heavily, looking over his shoulder to make certain that Ritska, Olga and Ash were still safe. The undead servant now attempting to get back onto his feet, the wounds on his body no longer looking as horrific as they had been moments earlier, but he was still sluggish. While it wasn't essential for unkindled to function, having a destroyed heart was still something that would hamper the body. Ritska cast his sight over the wreck of the street. The surrounding buildings had been leveled entirely as mysterious fires spread across the area. He felt himself cough heavily as smoke and ash from the attack assaulted his lungs. Debris exploded upwards from a nearby house as the Dragon Slayer armor emerged from the ground, hefting its shield up and revealing the undamaged form of Beatrice. Sif came sliding to a halt at the far end of the street. Gareth sat atop the wolf with a look of shocked panic on her face, having just barely been able to outrun the attack. Looking further across, Ritska caught sight of Arash. The bowman was covered in rather hideous burns across his right side where the blast had caught him. A flash of light later, Gwyndolin reappeared, virtually unscathed from the attack. A sudden gust of wind emanated from the origin of the attack, dissipating the cloud of smoke and revealing the form of Aldrich. Flesh and bone stitched itself back together as the saint gradually regenerated their body, although at a far slower rate than they had done previously. Aldrich stared at them impassively for a few moments before he looked upwards. A small smile soon began to stretch across his face as he gazed into the sky. Ritska followed his sight upwards and soon felt the flood leave his face. The vortex of clouds in the sky was glowing, or rather it was the complete opposite of a glow. An absence of color that it couldn't help but shine brightly, a paradoxical existence. The clouds converged inwards and began to thunderously growl. The saint stretched his arms into the sky as vortex began to spin faster and faster, slowly moving downwards towards the saint. You should be in awe. Aldrich exclaimed, his voice tinged with reverence. You shall bear witness to Aldrich, demon saint of the deep. My essence will spread across this world and consume this era. His eyes fell down until he locked gazes with Ritska. Contemplate your insignificance as mere mortals. Take a pittance of solace in the fact you forced some effort out of me. The cyclone of black liquid approached the saint until it was barely 100 meters from the ground. Golden chains sprang from the ground, wrapping themselves around Aldrich instantly. The saint sneered at Gwyndolin, who made ready their bow. The pitiful actions born of desperation of an antiquated being are no longer of concern to me. Tensing his body, the chains exploded in a shockwave of red energy. I need no longer fear you, weak as you all are now. His hand began to regrow. Flickers of light formed at his fingertips as his bone spear catalyst reformed itself. Had I more time, I would make your deaths last years, but I am simply eager at the prospect of claiming my rightful place as quickly as possible. His fingers enclosed themselves around the shaft of the weapon as his expression turned smug. So I shall simply kill you all now. Starting with you, Gwyndolin. Lowering the spear, the blade began to glow with violet lights and release hum which began to grow in intensity. He unleashed the beam of energy as Gwyndolin threw up a transparent shield. The Lord grit their teeth as the attack impacted against his defenses. While it was true he looked no worse for wear, he had been expending far too much magical energy when fighting Aldrich. Worse was that although he now had a contract with the human and was able to gain magical energy, his reserves were still nowhere near their peak. His shield began to crack, loud enough that it could be heard across the battlefield. Aldrich's expression turned victorious as the beam intensified in power. A purple beam of light shot across the field, slamming into Aldrich's shoulder and causing his attack to dissipate. Aldrich hissed in pain and Gwyndolin allowed himself a small moment of relief before his head turned towards the direction of his savior. In any other situation he would have gawked in shock, but as it stood he was simply too tired to properly react beyond a slight groan. Is that the gratitude I am to receive? Sullivan scoffed as he strode past Gwyndolin. Perhaps I should have left you be. Did thee expect words of thanks? Not truly. Sullivan admitted, turning his head away from Gwyndolin and towards Aldrich, but I didn't think it would have been necessary to begin with. I had thought the lords were powerful beings. Aldrich, meanwhile, was staring at Sullivan in disbelief. Pontiff. What is the meaning of this? I had thought it was obvious. Sullivan replied in a tone that made it clear the answer was simple, I am here to stop you. Admittedly, I had hoped to avoid this encounter but it simply can't be helped. Turning his head to stare at Verndari, Ritska, Ash and Olga he let out a slight chuckle as he caught sight of the Ashen One. That is quite the pitiful state you are in. Do not tell me you came simply to mock me. Ash bit back with a snarl, pushing himself to his feet. The glowing orb of the healing pyromancy began to fade away as he experimentally rolled his shoulder a few times. Not at first. Sullivan replied, but the temptation is certainly. What possible motive could you have to stop me? Aldrich cried out in confusion, you agreed with my plan from the very beginning. And saving Gwyndolin of all things. I thought you hated the lords most. I fail to recall at what point I told you I agreed with your plan. Sullivan responded with a shake of his head, and I told you I despised Gwyndolin for his actions, not his being. If he had simply allowed the flame to fade away I would have had no issue with him. Much like I have no issue with this world. Tightening his grip on his two great swords, he twirled them through the air before leveling the burning blade in his right hand at Aldrich. It is merely that I find your plan disagreeable. Aldrich blinked at him before he fell quiet for a few moments. Rising himself up before exhaling, that does indeed fall in line with your way of thinking, I suppose. I now understand I should have expected this outcome, had I known you were present. A smirk soon came to his features, but you are far too late, Sullivan. My ascension towards almightiness is nigh. Once I make contact with the deep, none can stop me. As skilled as you are, that alone are not enough to make up for the deficiency of power. I am well aware of that. Sullivan admitted with a nod, earning a brief look of surprise from Aldrich. It is why I decided to employ some aid. Aldrich furrowed his brows. Wah! A stream of fire slammed into the nearest tentacle, instantly scorching it before spreading downwards. The flames seemingly having a mind of their own as they greedily spread across the flailing limb. Aldrich let out a cry of shock and pain as he recoiled away from the burning limb, eyes quickly traveling away from it towards the source of the attack. Quelaag lowered her sword and stared at Aldrich in disgust. You ate my friend. Prepare to die, you hideous river of shit. Before Aldrich could respond, a metallic roar echoed out above his head. Turning his eyes upwards he reeled back just as the black armor of the smelter demon crashed into the ground in front of him sword first, the blade penetrated up to the hilt into the sludge surrounding Aldrich. The saint smirked, you miss. The smelter demon twisted the blade, unleashing a wave of fire from their being which instantly blasted the front of his body. Aldrich recoiled with a cry of pain as the extreme heat burnt away at the pillars as the berserker ripped its sword free of the ground. Still burning, the servant slashed the blade through his midsection as he attempted to retreat, earning a sizzling sound of meat being burnt as it was carved up. Ritska gaped at the sudden attack before Ash walked past him. I would feel sick if I owed my victory to Sullivan. He muttered under his breath, sending a glance towards his master. Shall we have a second go of it? The boy cracked a smirk his way. Yep. Soon stealing his expression, Archer. He called out to Rash. The servant looked over to him through his one working eye. Get over here. Ash ready a healing spell for when he gets here. The saber nodded and raised his palm again. I feel as though I should warn you that I cannot cast many pyromancies after this. Ash mentioned as the orb left his palm just as Archer slid to a halt in front of him. Ritsuka shook his head. Doesn't matter. As long as Archer can fire his bow, it's enough. He looked over his shoulder. Director. How is your berserker? The woman blinked suddenly at being addressed before casting a glance over at her servant. The armored being ripped its axe free of the ground before turning its head to face her. He is still capable of fighting. Mash. Ritsuka cried out to the shielder as the girl brought Nero over to the healing spell. As they approached, he helped sit the emperor down gently on the ground. Biting his lip, he looked over her. How bad? Hardly a concern. Nero boasted, a smile coming to her face. While I am quite horrified that I should be seen in this state, I am nonetheless pleased that the tide has turned in our favor. She blinked before looking up at the glowing orb above her head. I must confess, this healing magic of yours is making me feel quite wonderful. Ritsuka allowed himself a small chuckle at his behavior before turning to Mash. Keep running interference, try and protect everyone as best you can. What about you and the director? She replied back. Ritsuka gave her a tiny smile in response. We'll be fine. He tilted his head and activated the mental link. Beatrice, can you still cast sorceries? Yeah, I'm actually not that badly injured. She sounded rather surprised by that fact. Do you, want me to cast some more? Keep your distance and cast harassing spells towards Aldrich. Aim for the eyes of his weird tentacle things. Ritsuka got an affirmative before he turned his attention to Gwyndolin and Sullivan. I don't suppose you're raring to go, Gwyndolin. The Lord gave him the closest approximation of a flat look as he could give with half his face concealed behind a helmet. Sullivan merely scoffed and advanced on the action. I will do what I can. I suspect Gwyndolin shall join me soon enough. Provided Lady Quelaag leaves anything to slay. Gwyndolin remarked, a small note of amused nostalgia in his voice. She is quite the monster when angered. What about me and Sif, master? Gareth's voice caused him to jolt and turn around to face her. What are we going to do? His tentacles are where he shoots most of his beams. Ritsuka explained. You and Sif run around and try and cut them down, or at least distract them. He pointed towards the sky. We need to kill him and claim the Grail before whatever that nasty black goo is touches him. On it. Gareth beamed and nodded. Let's go, boy. The wolf released a howl before shooting off towards the action. Servants versus Ludwig Pav. The bolt of lightning struck his upper torso. Ludwig recoiled backwards with a growl as the electricity spread across the area of impact. The lightning burning away at the nerves in his body before it dispersed. Ludwig growled as he swept the blade through the air, releasing a wave of energy towards Solaire. The knight rolled to the side as the projectile of light exploded on the ground where he had been stood. Shooting forwards like a missile, Solaire slashed through the lower front leg of Ludwig. The beast stumbled as it tried to balance itself out. Swinging his own moonlight greatsword through the air, Lucian released a small wave of energy of his own. The arc of blue light struck Ludwig in the chest, leaving a burn mark in place as the beast screamed in agony. Raising his sword above his head, Ludwig struck. Repeatedly swinging the blade into the ground like a club as he tried to strike the two servants with a fanatic fervor. Debris was flung in all directions as Ludwig destroyed the environment as he attempted to reach the pair. Lucian backpedaled as Ludwig viciously slashed towards him, the glowing blade passing scarce inches from his body each time it was swung. Holding up his own sword, he knew it was folly to try and match Ludwig's strength, so he attempted to parry or divert the blows away from him as best he could. The blade was thrust towards his chest, tilting his body and holding his sword at an angle. The moonlight greatsword scrapped across the flat of the blade and barely avoided running through his shoulder. Ludwig twisted the sword in his grip before pushing towards the side. Sweeping the hunter off his feet, his hand darted into his coat before ripping out a pistol. With barely a second to aim, he pulled the trigger and allowed the quicksilver bullet to fly. The ball bearing impacted Ludwig's cheek, blasting small hole in the side of his face. Ludwig merely growled in annoyance before twisting his body to block a strike from Solaire. The sun shining brightly down upon him as his form began to glow. The two stayed locked for a few moments before Solaire managed to push Ludwig back slightly. The beast's eyes narrowed as it applied more force behind its sword arm. Solaire responded in kind as the battle of strength quickly turned into a shoving match. A barbed whip wrapped itself around Ludwig's sword arm. The beast's gaze snapped down to the rope and then followed the trail along to Lucian. The man holding the extended cane weapon tightly with one hand before he pulled. Faced with being attacked in two separate directions, Ludwig found their strength divided between the two servants. They swung their wounded arm, still torn down the middle from their attack against Lucian, towards Solaire like a pseudo-club. The knight caught the movement out of the corner of his eyes, parrying Ludwig's sword upwards as the hunter pulled the arm towards him. He twisted his body towards the oncoming arm and slashed downwards as the limb just shot past him, cutting the remains of the arm off. Spinning on his heel, Solaire reeled back his arm holding the sword and stared up at Ludwig before hurling his blade towards the beast's neck. The straight sword shot through the air like a missile before it slammed into the target, burying itself in Ludwig's throat. The beast attempted to grasp at the sword but found itself still lassoed by Lucian's whip. Pulling as hard as they could, Lucian felt his feet slowly being dragged through the mud as he found his strength outmatched by the beast. A steel gauntlet quickly took hold of the other side of the whip. Solaire gripped tightly against the weapon and began pulling alongside Lucian as the pair slowly started dragging Ludwig's arm towards them. The barbs along the steel line began to dig into the wrist, which caused the clawed fingers around the grip of the sword to slowly loosen their hold. With a cry of exertion, which came out more as a bloodied choke, Ludwig tightly gripped his sword in his one hand. The blade instantly burst into life with a brilliant light as his glazed eyes fell on the pair of servants. Ludwig stopped pulling against the strength of the two servants. The tension in the whip instantly slackened as the pair stumbled backwards. Eyes wide with alarm as Ludwig swung the blade towards them, power radiating from the weapon indicating that he was preparing to unleash a series of projectile slashes towards them. An arrow the size of a small tree instantly ran him through the chest with enough force behind it to send him stumbling backwards. Moonlight greatsword being flung from his hand as his mutated head looked down to the projectile buried in his torso. Slowly trailing his eyes up as Goff knocked another arrow. The giant let out a pained groan as he strained against his wounded shoulder, the miracle only being partially successful in healing him in the small time frame. Ludwig choked out a mouthful of sickly black blood as he struggled to remain on his feet. His body wavered as his legs started to buckle. Pulling back the bow to the point where the frame began to groan in protest, Goff stared at Ludwig for a tense few moments. Then loosened the arrow towards the beast, striking him in the head. The arrow punctured clean through the beast's skull, taking the top half of his head with it as it disappeared off into the distance. Ludwig's body abruptly dropped like a puppet whose strings had been severed. Their body remained upright for a few seconds before it teetered over and unceremoniously collapsed to the ground. Solaire and Lucian took their eyes away from the body as it started to flake away into golden motes of light, panting heavily as they turned to the giant who dropped his bow and fell onto his backside. Goff exhaled. 'Twas no dragon, but it made for a worthy hunt, he panted heavily, turning their head to look over their shoulder. I do not believe I can do much more, I fear. My job's done, Lucian remarked as he pushed himself to his feet, rolling his shoulders as his form began to fade away, only here for that one. Solaire got to his feet, extending a hand to Lucian. I am most pleased to have met you. I do so hope we can meet again in jolly cooperation. Lucian stared at the outstretched hand for a few moments before he extended his own and clasped it. Never met an actual knight before, he mused, staring Solaire in the eyes through his helmet. Certainly act like the children's stories. Solaire let out an amused laugh in response. Looking over to the city, Lucian took a step away from Solaire as the handshake ended. Hope they see it through. Indeed. Solaire nodded to him. Farewell, Sir Lucian. Not a sir. Lucian grunted, but shook his head. Farewell, Sir Solaire. Hope we don't meet again. That's a little rude, I think. My company is not that bad, surely. It isn't. Lucian chuckled mirthlessly as his form faded away, but mine is. With his parting words, his body scattered to the wind. Solaire watched it float away before turning around and making his way to where his sword lay in the ground, pulling it free. Canst thou still fight? Goff questioned him. Solaire let out a small laugh. Quote. Not well, I am afraid. He chuckled, slowly making his way towards the city again, but I am a warrior of sunlight. It would be a great disservice to my order if I did not make the attempt. Goff let out a small laugh in response. Thy patron lord would like thee much, I believe. Solaire paused, looking over his shoulder and up at Goff. Thank you. Truly, your words are, he let out a small sigh, they are most welcome. Be off then, warrior of the sun. Goff nodded his head. Should I fail to see her again, give my regards to Lady Quelaag and Lord Gwyndolin. Worry not. Solaire replied, I shall pass along your warmth if I am unable to. He paused when he caught sight of Cecilia stood in front of him. Is there an issue? If it would not be too great a burden on thee, it is my desire to be with milord. She paused. I have never seen the end of one of his tales, it would please me greatly to be there for one of his victories. Solaire smiled at her behind his helm, sheathing his sword and extending a hand to her. Do you wish me to carry you, or shall your summons do so? I no longer have the strength to call upon milord's shade. She admitted abashedly. Quote. It would not be too great a burden for thee. Of course not. Solaire laughed. Come, if it is a firekeeper's wish to see the end of the glorious adventure of their lord, then I shall abide it. Servants vs. Aldrich Pav. Mash darted in front of Quelaag, swinging her shield out in front of her and blocking the spell which meant to strike her. Aldrich seethed before a blast of blue light struck the eye which had fired the spell. The red orb exploded as the sorcery struck true. The tentacle reeling back as more spells landed. Aldrich snarled in anger, raising his spear and allowing the purple hue to take shape. Sif slammed into his side, causing his body to violently lurch and the spell to go wide, completely missing its target. The wolf slashed at his body before spinning off and running away. Aldrich changed his sights to the mongrel. A blue explosion of magical energy destroyed his rightmost tentacle. The meat pillar keeled over as Gareth's form sprinted away from it, her lance humming with power as the light wisps flickered away from the glowing midsection of the lance. Several beams of light slammed into his body. Aldrich recoiled as the burn marks spread across his torso, barely managing to catch sight of Gwyndolin lower his staff and ready his bow again. Aldrich widened his eyes in alarm, raising a pillar from the sludge beneath his body to act as a shield. A glowing purple blade instantly sliced through the tentacle wall, the defensive measure falling to the ground as Sullivan blurred past him in front. Within the span of a second, nearly a dozen arrows struck his body moving up towards his head. The glowing projectiles burned him where they struck, turning his central pillar into a pincushion. It was a one-sided massacre. Whenever Aldrich attempted to make some measure of counterattack, 3 or more servants would respond at any given time. Either mash of the Dragon Slayer armor would act as shields for the attacking servants, while it was all he could do to prevent himself from being overwhelmed entirely. His attempts to raise more tentacles to replace the ones he lost virtually failed. Even with the Grail he could feel himself being completely outmatched. Not that he could draw upon much power from it, he had been using it to support the ritual. He could feel the abyss drawing closer to him. All he had to do was survive long enough to ensure that he could make contact with the deep. The issue was in the surviving aspect of his plan. Quelaag's sword erupted in a jet of fire, extending far longer than her blade had done previously as she swung it through the air towards his upper body. In a feeble attempt to protect himself, Aldrich raised his puppet body's arms to try and protect his head. Quelaag's attack instantly scorched his skin, the chaos flames burning his arms to ash and continuing on until they struck his upper body. He leaned back to avoid the worst of the damage, far too slow to save his right side, the attack cleaving away the upper right portion of his torso and robbing him of his arm yet again. The saint barely had enough time to let out a cry of pain before another arrow punched a hole through his right side. His body snaked backwards, slamming into the remains of the forum behind him as his eyes traveled further up the street. Arash knocked another arrow as the burns gradually healed across his body, loosening it and striking Aldrich further down towards the base of his pillar, causing him to heavily lean over to one side. Aldrich doubled over, heaving severely as he felt the sickly sensation of blood rise up through his throat. His eyes flickered over the group in front of him. Desperately he started to channel all the magical energy he could muster. Raising his single hand into the sky outstretched as if to grasp something, Incineration Ritu, His attack was cut off, a spew of blood erupted from his mouth as something thudded against his body. He could feel a cold sensation running through his chest as something had run him through. He slowly lowered his gaze to his chest. Seeing the black sword of ash buried up to the hilt in his midsection, fixing him in place into the stone wall behind him. Aldrich's eyes burned with rage as he stared into the T-shaped visor of the unkindled. He could think nothing more than the rage, the sheer humiliation of being denied his ascension yet again by the very same unkindled. The same worthless creature which had denied him. His remaining arm lashed out and enclosed itself around Ash's neck, gripping the servant tightly as his eye burned with fury. His chest parted open, revealing a red eye, cross-shaped black pupil focused on the ashen one in front of him. He heard Ash's gasp of surprise at the sudden appearance of the mystic eye on his chest. It didn't matter. If he died, he would at least take the accursed unkindled with him. A cry caught his attention, a blur of red appeared to his left and quickly got closer. Aldrich's head snapped towards it, only to notice the form of Nero rocketing towards him. Sword alight with fire and her face set in a soundless cry as she approached him. The eye on his chest snapped its focus towards the Emperor and glowed brightly, the pupil constricted itself as a beam launched towards the Emperor. Ash set his sword on fire seconds before. The unkindled ripped the burning black blade outwards, causing Aldrich's aim to go wide. The magical spear of power went just left of the Emperor. Instead of taking away her head, it succeeded only in burning the right side of her face as she approached him. Aldrich felt time slow down as the Emperor approached him, the burning sword slicing through the air towards his neck while Ash tore the onyx blade up through his body, splitting the eye on his chest in half as they cleaved their way through. I was so close. Just one more step, and I would have. Nero's blade fell, cutting straight through Aldrich's neck and sending the head flying from his body at the same time Ash ripped his sword upwards, splitting the torso vertically as they kicked away. The hand around his neck went limp. Planting his boots on the body, he pushed back with all his might and kicked it into the wall. The pillar collapsed backwards and fell through the remains of the stone building. The tentacles keeled over, their form no longer being created as they were reduced to sludges of meat. Ash felt his back slam into the ground with a wheeze as Nero hit the ground, rolling for a few meters before she came to a stop. Hissing in pain as her hand clasped over the wound on her right side, the ugly burn mark which spread across the upper portion of her cheek. Ash-san. Mash called out to him. Ash slowly sat up and gestured to the body, the form of Aldrich slowly flaking away into golden motes. Forget me. The Grail is right here. A silence pervaded across the battlefield. The heads of everyone slowly fell onto Sullivan, the pontiff holding the golden chalice in his hand. I was right, he did in fact keep it further in his sanctum. He mused, staring over the cup with a fascination as he turned his eyes to the sky. To think that he was mere moments away from opening up a portal to the deep. He let out a chuckle, thwarted by the same unkindled and the lord he devoured. The caster turned his eyes to the fading form of Aldrich. I am no true believer in fate and preordained destiny, but it is in situations like these where I am forced to wonder. Ash pushed himself back to his feet, using his greatsword as a crutch, the Grail Sullivan. Now. The pontiff turned to them, then looked down at the chalice in his hands. Ah yes, this little thing. I had heard so much about it and to think it was no more than a mere wine goblet. Such a tiny thing with so much potential. Ash tensed his hand as he made to take a step forwards. And if I were back in Lothric, I would have used this in a heartbeat. He went on, carelessly tossing it towards Olga. The girl let out a yelp as she juggled the grail before clutching it tightly to her chest. It seems we always discover that which we desire when we no longer have need of it. Turning his head back to Ash, his laugh was far more hollow this time. I suppose that is another example of fate. Ash's head darted between the Grail and Sullivan in obvious confusion. What good would the Grail do me now? Sullivan scoffed. There is no cycle to undo here and any attempt I made to use the Grail would merely freeze this era alone. I refuse to lower myself to the god's level. Speaking of. He turned to face Gwyndolin. The Lord stared back at him for a few seconds. Indeed, he then scowled. Thou art a cur. Name calling. He mocked. How base, Lord Gwyndolin. Quelaag looked between the two with a raised eyebrow. I thought you were going to kill him. 'Twas before he grit his teeth, almost choking on the words. Rendered aid unto me. To strike him down now would be an act of insult to the lords. The honor of the Dark Moon Knights. Sullivan remarked. Where aid is granted, it must be gifted in turn. Snake. A rather ironic insult. Quelaag rolled her eyes as the two began trading insults between each other, moving over to Mash with a smirk. See where honor gets you. I would rather her view of honor not be skewered by your poisonous words. She rolled her eyes at Vrindari's growl, turning her head to snark back before she froze. Her eyes fixing themselves on his missing arm. Quelaag bit her lip as a laugh started to build in her throat. Mash felt a headache coming on. I suppose it was fortuitous timing that the filthy little chaos demon was here to lend a hand to the helpless knight. Vrindari's helm stared back at her impassively for several seconds before the man replied to her in a tired tone of voice, I fucking hate you. Such crass language. For shame. Quelaag replied, a false look of shock writ across her features. To think you would use such words in the presence of a young maiden like Mash. She gestured to the lilac-haired girl would look like she would rather be anywhere but there. Vrindari glared at her before he turned away and gradually marched over to where Ritska was. The boy crouched down by the Emperor's side. It's not that bad, right? Nero asked him through gritted teeth. Ritska opened his mouth to reply then closed it again. Right. I'm sure you can get some make-up. Oh Fortuna. Why did you abandon me? Nero wailed, slumped her shoulders. How can I claim to be an aspect of Venus if my beauty is marred in such a way? Well, a glowing ring appeared around the Emperor. The pair stared at it in shock before the light traveled upwards, consuming her form for a few seconds before it parted. Nero and Ritska being left blinking in shock before he felt his eyes widen as he gaped at the Emperor. Nero caught his expression and felt a pang of anxiety in her. The pain which had assailed her had vanished, but it was a numb feeling as if it had never been in pain to begin with. It was only made worse by the shocked look on Ritska's face. What? What's wrong? Why your face? What about my face? I'd say it worked well enough. Ash's amused voice cut in between the two of them. Nero and Ritska's head snapped towards him just in time to see Cecilia lower her hands from Nero's direction while Ash stood next to her with his arms crossed, Solaire just behind him shaking his head in bemusement. See Cecilia. Nero gaped, then hid herself. Do not gaze upon me like this. I cannot bear the shame of being. That is the strangest reaction to being healed I have ever seen. Solaire chuckled. Nero paused as his words, turning back to him. Indeed. Ash similarly let out a small laugh as he pat Cecilia on the shoulder, the firekeeper's shoulders slightly slumped and a tiny frown on her face. I am certain it is only an exception, Cecilia. I am sure the next one you heal will be more welcoming of the result. Healed. Nero parroted, her hand going to her face as widening as she started to pat down at the area of her face which had been burned. A mirror. I need a mirror. Vrindari chose that rather poor moment to approach them, my liege. You have a large mirror as a shield. Nero pointed at him, eyes wide and frantic, give it to me. What in the bloody? Give it quickly. Get the hands off. Vrindari struggled as Nero tried to pry his shield out of his hands. Emperor Nero. Damn it, woman. He huffed, turning his shield so it faced her. What is it? Nero stared at her reflection in the shield with a shocked awe, gingerly reaching up and pressing her fingers into the completely healed cheek several times. She pulled her hand back and stared at her fingers before a giddy smile came to her face. Still can't believe I missed the fighting. Solaire lamented. I ran all this way too. From how you look I would say you were not exactly missing opponents. Ash gestured to the burns and cuts in his armor. What happened? Well, I got into a fight with the strangest of horses. Cecilia. Nero's cry brought their attention to the Emperor as the woman glomped onto the firekeeper. Ash stiffened at the sight, which wasn't missed by either Arash or Gareth, who merely rolled their eyes in amusement at him. You are a precious gift of the gods. The woman in question had a completely baffled look on her face. Thy thanks is most welcome, but this display of affection is nonsense. Nero beamed, hugging the woman tighter. None may spur an emperor's affection. Olga stared at the grail in her hands before her eyes traveled back to the spot where Aldrich had disappeared. The woman bit her lip as his shoulders trembled slightly. Director. What? The woman jolted, turning around to see Ritska staring at her with concern. Is something wrong? No. She coughed into her hand, desperately trying to avoid showing the slight tremble in her movements. We have retrieved the Grail and defeated Aldrich. The cause of this singularity is resolved. Her eyes traveled up to where the cloud above their heads had been moments ago, the sky now clear blue. Should we, contact Roman? We shish. Lise answer. Romani's panicked voice came through, please. We don't have anyone else to send down and she's starting to scare me now. Romani. Olga blinked in confusion as she turned on her communicator. The doctor's frazzled face came up moments later. What on earth are you talking about? Director. The man let out a sigh of relief. Thank goodness. Please tell me Fujimaru-kun is alright. I'm getting worried. He let out a squawk as he was pushed away from the screen. The sound of a scuffle was heard as Olga and Ritsuka exchanged looks of confusion before turning back to the screen. Anshin-sama. Ritsuka choked on air. Sullivan stared down at his hand as his form slowly turned transparent. It appears our time here is drawing to a close. Your time perhaps. Gwendolyn mused with a small amused expression. Sullivan stared at him, noticing that his body wasn't turning transparent. What? The pontiff stared at him, tilting his head in confusion, but without the source of our summon here, we should no longer. Amusing. Gwendolyn chuckled. For all thy claim to intellect, thee never thought to forge a contract with the Chaldeans. The Lord gave him a beatific smile which lacked any trace of kindness or humor. Farewell, deceiver. Sullivan's curse was cut off as his body vanished. You enjoyed that. Quelaag mused, how vindictive of you. I may not have been able to kill him, but that doesn't stop me from enjoying his passing. Gwendolyn replied. He slowly turned his head to face Quelaag as she began to vanish into motes of light. His expression became more sullen. Lady Quelaag. The woman raised an expectant eyebrow at him. Gwendolyn let out a scoff. Quelaag. The woman gave him a tiny smile. So you see again. I'm sure we'll meet again. The woman waved her hand, giving him a tiny smirk. Besides, I refuse to leave you to stew among the company of mortals. They don't deserve to be burdened with your morose attitude. Gwendolyn covered his mouth, barely holding back the tiny laugh that escaped his lips. The last word is always. Well, I do have to speak for that giant oaf as well. She remarked with a shrug. I wish he could have been here. Always was a little slow. The warrior of sunlight passed along his regards. Gwendolyn replied. And I am sure you shall meet him again. His smile took on a mischievous edge. You have yet to confess your love for him. Quelaag sputtered. Why you? The fuck do you? She recognized Gwendolyn's look of victory. So this is how it feels. No wonder you enjoy it so much. Oh you son of a. Her form dissipated into the wind. Farewell, Quelaag. He whispered to himself. I wonder if they remember summonings. He suddenly thought to himself, then shivered at the thought of what Quelaag would do if she saw him again. Nero stared at the vanishing form of Cecilia with a shocked expression. Ash stared at Solaire as the knight nodded to him. I hope we do meet again. Solaire held his helmet under his arm, smiling at Ash as he did the same. It has been too long since I fought with a fellow warrior of the sun. To you as well. Ash nodded back to him, extending a hand to him. When we meet again, we shall partake in jolly cooperation. Solaire finished with a grin as he clasped the limb tightly. Goodbye. Ash of Lothric. May the blessings of the sun be with you, Solaire of Astora. The knight nodded back to him as his form disappeared. Ash swallowed the lump in his throat as he turned to Cecilia. He opened his mouth only for the woman to shake her head. Do not speak of partings, my lord. She gave him a small smile. We shall meet again. Ash blinked at her. How can? She cut him off when she tapped the metal cover across her eyes. As painful as it was, her smile widened. It provided a great comfort. Her head turned to Nero. I thank thee, Emperor. Thy kindness to me has been most welcome. Do you have to go? Nero's voice sounded somewhat small. I do. Cecilia nodded, but like my lord, I am sure we shall meet again. She paused for a few moments, fidgeting slightly. If it would please thee, I pondered upon whether we could be friends. Nero gave Cecilia a slow blink before her face turned bright. For one who ensure the preservation of the flower of Olympia, friendship is but a small reward. Cecilia smiled. Farewell Nero. She turned to the unkindled. Farewell Ashen. Farewell Ash. Farewell Cecilia. Ash nodded back to her as she vanished, releasing a breath before he slid his helmet back onto his head. Hiding away his expression, he looked over his shoulder, back towards Ritska and the director before turning down to look at the Emperor. If Cecilia believed you would meet again, then she spoke truthfully. Such a kindly woman. Yes. Indeed. No. But. Absolutely not. What is she said? She wouldn't. How do you? We are not going through this again. But she. Not. Again. Nero let out a low growl before huffing and looking away with a pout. Her eyes then fell upon someone else and gleamed with interest. Ash watched as she stalked silently towards Olga, his helmet hiding his barely amused smile at her antics. That will end well. Arash called out from behind him. Did your seeings tell you that? Beatrice looked at him in intrigue. Arash let out a scoff of amusement and shook his head. I don't think that clairvoyance is necessary for this. How did she even get there? Olga gaped at the screen. How? No one summoned anything, did they? I don't know. Roman called back. She literally just appeared in Ritska's room. She came to the command room still holding his bedsheets. My what? Ritska squawked in shock. Why? The thought of my Anchin-sama being in danger was terrible to my maidenly heart. Kiyohime lamented, still cradling the bedsheets in her arms. I felt as though I had to be close to you, so that I could send my love to you wherever you were. Ritska gave her a strained smile. That's a very nice sentiment. Olga and Roman gave him a flat look while Kiyohime squealed in delight. I knew you would understand, Anchin-sama. Ritska let out a small whimper, then noticed the look Olga was giving him. What? The woman rolled her eyes. You need to grow a spine. She is apparently your servant. Tell her to leave you be and not to make unwanted advances. It's nothing challenging to rid yourself of troublesome clingy. Pale rose. Awa. Olga released a cry of surprise as she found herself swept off her feet and carried bridal style by Nero. Gaze upon my face, pale rose. The Emperor beamed down at her. Cecilia has restored my beautiful visage and undone the crime that was the attack on my beauty by the foul creature. Is it not wonderful? Put me down. You know. Director. Ritska coughed into his hands, completely missing the frantic motions of Romani to tell him to not say anything more. I hear that getting rid of clingy people is really nothing. You third-rate hack. Olga hissed at him. When we get back to Chaldea, so help me. Director. Mash interrupted her with a hesitant expression. We, should probably get back to Chaldea. She gestured to the other shielder, Verndari Sensei's wounds. Right. Olga composed herself, staring blankly at the Emperor. Can you please set me down? Nero muttered, setting her back on her feet. A frown flitting across her face. You are leaving so soon. But, what about a celebration? I have not even rewarded you. That is, Ritska raised his hands. That isn't necessary, Emperor Nero. We're fine just helping out. Nero gave him a strange expression, but. Really? Ritska shook his head at her. It's fine. He looked back at the screen. Kiyohime was staring at Nero from behind her fan. Her eyes squinted dangerously. Also we. Have a slight situation to sort out. Well. Nero rubbed her forehead. Cecilia did say we would meet again. She eventually nodded her head, her expression shifting into a wide smile. It is decided. When we meet again, I will throw you a grand feast to celebrate your achievement here. We will hold many games in your honor. That sounds like something I'd like to see. Romani called out from behind the screen, like some kind of, Olympic Games. Olympic. The Emperor scrunched her face up. I was leaning more towards Nerifest, formless voice. I mean it's catchy but that's a little on the nose, right? Romani. Olga gave a polite cough and gave him a tight smile, the ray shift. The doctor gave a nervous chuckle. Right. Beginning the procedure now. Ritska and Mash sweat dropped at the doctor's antics before turning back to face the Emperor, giving one last nod towards her as a light slowly surrounded them. Farewell. Nero waved at them. I look forward to meeting again. With a flash of light, the group vanished. Leaving only Nero stood in the center of the ruined city. Second Singularity. The all-consuming empire, completed. Second Singularity done and dusted. Resting at a lovely 20 chapters long and taking up a majority of the length of the FIC thus far. Anyway. So why did I initially change the second singularity up a bit? Well, it wasn't really my favorite, and while I wouldn't be as boastful to say I improved anything, I wanted it to make a bit more narrative sense. I also realized I sidelined some of our more favorite characters, but don't worry. They'll be summoned soon and get their spot in the limelight. Mainly because the servants like Spartacus, Jinke, Boudica and that are kind of sidelined. I want to give some of the lesser-known Fate and Dark Souls characters some presence to them. Kind of why I made the Looking Glass Knight into Vrindari to begin with. He is technically the second OC character I have written with some depth, like ever. The first being Ash and the third being Lucian. The Chaldean staff don't really count too much as they've had bits and pieces. But I like what I did with Vrindari. He's fair, but he's a little stern when it comes to combat and has a fixed sense of what he considers right and wrong and isn't too afraid to let his opinion known to anyone other than his master. Anyway, as I said previously, this is mainly a Dark Souls-focused FIC. The presence of other characters like Lucian and Ludwig from Bloodborne was like a nice cameo. They won't have a great impact on the story outside. It's like when you had that FGO and Garden of Sinners event. Anyway, had some questions about whether or not I would include Elden Ring and the like. I'll be honest. Dark Souls 1-3 and Bloodborne are the only Souls games I've played. I wasn't able to play Demon's Souls when it came out, namely because I didn't own a PlayStation at the time, and I'm too poor to afford a PS5. If there was ever one in stock. I haven't played Sekiro, because I don't really have an excuse for that one. As for Elden Ring, I probably won't be able to play that until the end of next month for various reasons. Will I include other FromSoft characters? Probably, but don't expect them to have as great an impact on the story at all. It's still a Dark Souls-focused FIC. Anyway, as you can see, the chapters got way longer. We went from like 4K words in the beginning to now 10K. Actually, I think this chapter will put the story's total word count up to around 270,000. Huh, go figure. See you next time. Also, the question of shipping. I'll be honest. I didn't really consider it all that much until recently. I wasn't going to ship Ritska with the servants, because they're dead and there are various crimes surrounding that. I joke. But seriously, he was definitely going to go with Mash. As for Ash, well, not so much for him really, it just didn't seem right for me to ship him with anyone. As for other Souls characters, well, as you've probably seen with Archon's dialogue, he's got a bit of a crush on Nagao Kagetora. There will be other instances of such things. Whether anything comes of them, who knows? Chapter 44. Aftermath. Materialization in progress. The intercom called out as the room burst into life, the coffins glowed as the individuals manifested within them, summoning procedure completed. Ash instantly stumbled out of his coffin, face planting onto the floor and coughing out another mouthful of blood. Groaning in frustration as he did so, Arash was soon by his side slowly helping him back to his feet with a look of concern. Take it you still aren't at 100%. The archer quizzed. Ash shook his head in response. My heart wasn't fully healed before I went back into combat. He explained, grimacing behind his helm as he straightened up. In truth, I wouldn't make for much of an opponent as of right now. Good thing the fighting's done, The archer quipped, although his eyes still held a smidgen of concern for the saber. Hefting his arm over his shoulder, he took on some of Ash's weight onto himself. Come on, not sure if they're good for it, but we should still get you to a doctor or something. I'm not entirely certain you can treat undead that way, Ash chuckled, shaking his head in amusement, but as you say, it would be better if I rested up. I believe Sigward has some healing miracles that can be. The crack of air and a trumpet-like noise had the servants immediately assume a combat position. Except Ash and Vrindari, the latter of which let out a grunt of surprise before falling onto his right side. Hissing as his exposed wound hit the ground. Ash freed himself from Arash's grip, manifesting his sword before he let out another mouthful of blood and collapsed to his knees. The attention of the servants fell onto the doorway. Astolfo stood there with a party popper in his hand, a strained smile on his face as the confetti slowly rained down into his hair. A large white banner with the words, "Welcome home," hung up behind him. The paladin's eyes took in the form of Ash on the ground, then moved over to Vrindari with a missing arm before they moved onto the large burn marks across Sif's fur. Then onto the new individual, stood in the center of the room with their sun-shaped helmet facing their direction. Astolfo found his eyes drawn to the snakes which seemed to function as their legs. So, Astolfo nervously chuckled. How was your trip? You get any souvenirs? Pausing for a few seconds, he eventually pointed towards the new individual. Do they count? Thou stands in the presence of Lord Gwyndolin, god of the Darkmoon, boy. The Lord spoke down to him, thee will address me with all due. I'm not a gur. Astolfo froze, his eyes going wide before a giddy smile came to his face. Letting out a yelp of joy, he sprinted over to the god. You could tell I was a boy immediately. Amazing. He slowly paused. Hey. Strange, I feel some weird connection with you. How odd. The paladin shrugged his shoulder, then cupped his chin before humming in thought. After a few seconds he eventually snapped his fingers, God of the Moon, right? That must be it. The pink-haired boy nodded to himself, obviously pleased in his deduction. I once rode my hippogriff to the moon. Quote. You rode what to where? Gwyndolin replied eventually, sounding far more confused than insulted at the sudden breach in his personal space. The sheer baffling nature of that statement took him off guard. It would be best if he returned to spirit form. Olga nodded over to Vrindari as Gareth propped him back up. It would conserve his energy and allow for his wounds to heal. Ritska gave a wordless nod before turning to the shielder, Vrindari. I heard, my liege. The knight cut him off sharply, then paused before exhaling, apologies. It is, simply vexing to me that I had been caught off guard so easily and disarmed. I think we were all caught off guard. Ritska replied, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't think that Aldrich could do that. It was likely when he consumed Lev. Olga remarked coldly, soon furrowing her brows. No. He referred to him as Flauros. Lev also called himself that as well. Ritska coughed. Is it important? He flinched when Olga gave him a sharp look before she exhaled, running her hand through her hair. I forget you are barely a novice when it comes to the world of magi. The woman composed herself. A short version is that Flauros is the name of one of the 72 demon familiars that King Solomon contracted during his life. Ritska blinked. So, Lev was working for Solomon? Of course not. The woman snorted. Aside from the fact that Solomon has been dead for nearly 3,000 years, to even consider that the creator of magecraft himself was the origin of this entire fiasco would be the height of folly. Pausing for a few moments, she quickly added on, more importantly than that, King Solomon as a servant would be far above what we have here in terms of power. No, it is more likely that Lev merely took on the name. So, he was a demon that took on the name of another demon. The evidence points in that direction. She looked down to the Grail in her hands before she placed it in his. Give that to Da Vinci, see if she can do something to contain it. What about you? I am going for a long nap. Olga brushed past him as she made for the exit of the room. There is much to consider. Ritska watched as she departed with a small frown, slowly looking down to the Grail in his hands. Senpai. He blinked, looking up to see Mash giving him a look of concern. Is something wrong? I don't know. He muttered, sending a glance in the direction that Olga had disappeared off to. Do you think the director is all right? Mash frowned, sending a troubled look towards where the woman had retreated. After a few moments, she turned back to Ritska. I'm sure she'll be fine, senpai. The director, she's strong. I'm certain she'll pull through. A non-committal hum was Ritska's response before he let out a sigh. Well, I assume you've known her longer than me. Raising the Grail to eye level, he waved it in his hand. We should probably get this to Da Vinci. Probably, senpai. Thy facility is most spacious. The pair blinked in surprise, their heads darting over to the familiar voice. 'Tis also in a state of disrepair. Gwyndolin slowly turned to face them, staring at their gobsmacked expressions. Is there some issue? So, Romani leaned back in his chair, staring at the trio in front of him with wide eyes. You somehow brought back a divine spirit, by accident no less, with you into Chaldea barely half an hour after another servant somehow summons herself in your room. Ritska flinched. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds a little far-fetched. Really? Roman let out a sigh of relief. Not just me then. He spun his chair so it faced Gwyndolin. So. Lord Gwyndolin, right. Indeed. Roman coughed into his hand, suddenly looking far more nervous as not only the Lord stared him down, but also all the snake heads slithering along the ground. Do you want Fujimaru-kun to give you the tour? He hastily asked. Is that not the way of accepting guests? Gwyndolin replied in his still imperial tone, slowly turning their gaze to Ritsuka. Finish thy simple delivery and return to present this, Chaldea, to me. Do not tally. All right. Ritsuka bowed his head and quickly sprinted out of the room. So, we have an actual god somewhere in Chaldea. CU summarized. Sigward next to him gave a slow blink as the pair stared down at Ash. The unkindled sitting on the small bed in the infirmary. He gave a quick nod in response. It seems his contract with Ritsuka brought him with us. Ash explained. In truth I had not expected that, but given that the crossbreed has somehow summoned herself here, it is not too far-fetched. CU blinked at the odd word, crossbreed. I believe her name is Kiyohime. Ash squinted his eyes as he attempted to pronounce the name. She is the girl with the light green hair. Kiyohime I think it was. CU corrected, scratching his chin. I assume by crossbreed you mean like a mix between human and dragon, right? Is it called something different here? Not that I know. The Lancer shrugged his shoulders, but I think she turned herself into a dragon spirit or something. Oh. Way of the dragon then. Ash nodded his head. That makes sense, I suppose. I get the feeling you're missing something here, but I'm not all that familiar with Eastern legends. Even with the Grail. He grunted. So. God. Lord Gwyndolin. The unkindled replied. We met his older brother. Oh shit, the big guy with the dragon. CU gaped. So what can he do? Illusions. Ash shrugged. Use spells. Fire arrows. Illusions, CU rubbed his chin. If I were a caster I'd probably be a bit more interested in them. Still, for an archer they seem pretty handy. I could imagine that being hit by one would hurt. I feel as though we are being terribly calm about one of the original lords of Lordran currently wandering Chaldea. Sigward pointed out with a raised eyebrow. It is a rather unusual experience. Ash slowly turned his head to stare at Sigward, then looked the man up and down before raising an eyebrow. I feel as though a similar comment could be made about your current attire. What? Sigward looked down at his clothes. The Onion Knight had foregone his usual armor and was instead wearing black formal trousers, smart shoes, a white button-up shirt with a black tie around his collar with a dark gray vest over the top. Is there some issue with my clothes? Sigward frowned. I believe they are perfectly in keeping with my new role. New role? Ash queried. CU chuckled and gestured to him. Meet the new barkeep/cook. The Lancer shook his head at Ash's look of disbelief. Yeah. Guy says he has no taste buds, then proceeds to cook some of the best food I've ever eaten. It is simply a matter of experience. Sigward chuckled, dismissing the compliment with a wave of his hand. Once you get the timings understood and have a good grasp of the ingredients, cooking is a simple matter to do. Even unkindled can perform it. A small frown came to his face. Regrettable as it is that I shall be unable to taste my own cooking, I suppose. You make a fine Estus soup, Sigward. Ash reassured him, rolling his shoulder. I believe that your miracles have done their work. Jumping off the bed, he winced and rubbed the area of his chest above his ear. Always hate injuries there. I suspect most people would. CU dryly remarked. Then again, most don't really walk off having their heart destroyed. It wasn't a matter of walking it off. Ash shot back with a huff. It just slowed me down was all. Oh no, my heart got obliterated and now I can't run as fast. The Irish servant rolled his eyes. That's some freaky battle continuation you have there. If you got cut in half, could you still move? I suspect that would kill me. Really? Yes. Personal experience. A dozen times. Ash clicked his tongue, and being run through the heart could have just as easily killed me too, after a while. If Aldrich had been able to press his advantage while I was distracted, he may have finished me. Oh, so now a fatal wound to you is a mere distraction. I have the unusual feeling you are aggravated by something. The unkindled pointed out. Sigward nodded behind him. CU sighed and threw his hands up in annoyance. What the hell is the point of a spear that instantly pierces the heart if the guy I'm using it on just looks at me like I'm a fucking chump? The Lancer whined, first with that Gale guy in France and now this. I'm going to start feeling made fun of. In fairness, we are already dead. Ash pointed out, I suspect an attack like that would work on the living. Not that big a deal. Cu sniffed, shaking his head. Can always just use the magical thorns of his spear to ruin someone's day. Magical what now? So he was firing laser beams around everywhere. Gareth recalled to the person opposite her, then there were the nasty meat pillars which were covered in more of the eyes, and then there was the spells. Sounds great. Andre muttered back as he continued to hammer away at his forge, Aldrich right. Told he was a piece of work. He was, very memorable. Gareth cringed, kind of like something that King Arthur would have fought, slowly trailing off. The girl slumped her shoulders, also King Arthur might have been a woman. Andre's hammer paused mid-strike. The smith slowly furrowed his brows, turning his head to stare at the young girl with a befuddled expression. Feel as though ya don't understand what the title of king means. No. Gareth shook her head. I mean she hid her gender. Makes sense. Why? He paused. Couldn't she have just been a queen? No. That spot was, already reserved. Also we didn't really have queens as rulers. Suppose it makes sense. Andre shrugged his shoulders, returning to his work. You said the role of queen was reserved, yes. I did. Was your queen a man? No. Just askin', Andre replied. With your king being a woman, thought your queen being a man would have been in line with it. Well, she wasn't. Gareth huffed, crossing her arms and looking away. I don't think anyone else was a woman. She then paused, her eyes slowly widening, unless, Bedivere always looked quite pretty, maybe they were. Sounds like a grand confusing time. Andre muttered under his breath as he held up his freshly forged sword. A simple straight sword. Giving the weapon a once-over, he nodded his head. Standing up and moving over to the side of the room which had a rack of weapons. Primarily swords and spears lining it. Gareth noticed him do so and raised a curious eyebrow. How come you're making loads of weapons? I'm a humble smith, forging weapons is my purpose. Andre replied, moving over to his forge. The art of smithing is like a weapon. Best it's well cared for and regularly used, otherwise it'll rust. Gareth nodded her head. I guess that makes sense. Also never knew a group of warriors who didn't need swords. He went on, might need 'em for something. Never hurts to have 'em. What, like golems? Had those too, did you? Andre mumbled, then nodded his head. Golems aren't all that good, although the ones in Drangleic were always said to be the best around. Never saw one though, heard of 'em. Gareth did a double take. Isn't Drangleic where Sir Vendari is from? Is it? Andre shrugged, never asked him. Don't you also know Ash? Yes. Isn't there, like, a really long gap in time between Ash and Vendari? Oh, Andre paused, furrowing his brows in thought for a few moments before nodding his head. A few thousand winters by my count. Probably more. How old are you? Well, probably about as old as I look. The smith chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. Doesn't matter too much, does it? Gareth mulled it over in her head before she shrugged. I suppose so. Still, it's a bit of a shock. That and there's also a god currently running around Chaldea. Andre's hammer missed and struck his thumb. The smith yelped, wringing his hand repeatedly before shooting a questioning look at Gareth. Run that by me again. Gwyndolin. Gareth explained. A god from. I know who he is. Andre grumbled. Been a long time since I've seen him though. Used to live in Anor Londo before I left. Was an apprentice to the smith god. Really? Good smith too. Also taught a giant how to forge. He shrugged, shame he'd passed but no helping it. Didn't interact much with the other lords. Mainly the silver knights who broke their weapons and that. Do you want to go meet him? Probably not. Andre looked away, not my place too. Besides, I'm not half the fool some people take me for. Gareth stared at him in slight confusion for a few moments before she shrugged, alright. Do you want to hear some more stories? Why are you here anyway? Andre asked her, not that I mind a conversation, but I've not had one for many a winter. Well, Gareth rubbed the back of her neck, letting out a nervous chuckle in response. Astolfo is kind of kidnapping Gwyndolin for a tour right now. The pink-haired boy. Andre cringed slightly. Doesn't sound like good company right now, a little more hysterical than I'm used to. Well, Astolfo is away with Gwyndolin and everyone else went to the cafeteria. Reason you aren't there. Thought you might get lonely. Gareth shrugged. It felt a little sad to me that you didn't really get that many people to talk to. Andre chortled, putting his hammer down and shaking his head. That's a first. Not that I don't mind the company, I suppose. Turning back to his forge, he placed the metal in the open flame. Not too many really talked to the smith. Save Ash. And there was this one fella years ago. He often stopped by too, back when the undead were fairly new. He paused, scratching his beard. Well. It was 2,000 years after they first started turning up, but still fairly new. That's not really new. Everything is new when you live long enough. The smith responded with, still. If you're gonna lay about here, suppose I can't really do much to stop ye. Alright. Gareth nodded her head, remaining silent for a few moments before she opened her mouth to speak again. So do you know how to make jousting lances? And these. Astolfo threw the door open. Is supply closet number 5? Is there any difference to supply closet number 4? Gwyndolin tiredly asked, although he could already guess the answer. Nope. I see, the Lord replied in a dead tone of voice. Is there anything else thee requires to show me? Well, we have another 15 supply closets to go through. Astolfo hummed, rapidly tapping their foot on the floor while cupping their chin. There's also the armory, well. It's the armory now because we have a smith in there, but it used to be an old storage house apparently. Now we just have an old guy living there who makes weapons, which is pretty weird considering none of his servants are probably ever going to use them. Well, except for that Sasaki guy, his sword got broken to he had to have a new one made, but apart from that I don't see anyone really needing them. He stopped for breath, then opened his mouth to speak again. Art thou the jester of Chaldea? Gwyndolin suddenly asked, because I beg the answer truthfully, nay, I demand the answer truthfully. Jester. You mean like a clown? Astolfo blinked, then laughed loudly, ha. Nope. I'm Astolfo of the Paladins of Charlemagne. I am also the cutest one in Chaldea. Thou art a paladin. Yep. And Charlemagne was the king of the Franks. Thou were the paladin of a king. I was indeed. I see. Yeah, Astolfo sniffed slightly, then grinned again. Now come along, Linny. What didst thou call? We've got more places to explore. Astolfo grabbed the Lord's hand and sped off down the hallway, dragging the god behind him. I am a lord of Anor Londo and son of Gwyn, lord of sunlight and king of the gods. I will not be paraded around by some childish. Gwyn right. I think we met your older brother. Man. Astolfo whistled, he sure was scary. Had a big bird dragon and everything. Luckily he helped us because I did not like fighting him. Listen to me, mortal. I mean, did you know his spear could shoot lightning bolts? Because I didn't. I know what his. Then he fought Sigurd and the poor onion guy looked cooked. He paused, then let out another laugh. Get it? Cooked. Because he looks like an onion. Stop speaking. So anyway. Big disaster. Ash recounted. Take one step into the house, and the spiders have got the people strung up on the walls. He gestured wildly to articulate his point. So, it's already approaching a level of disturbing that even I find intolerable. Then I notice that the bodies are bloated. Fucking grim. Exactly. Ash nodded to see you. Turns out, the spiders have been laying eggs in them, which was fairly disturbing. So, I'm already cautious as it. Then I hear a sound of something thumping into wood. He paused for effect. I look over to where the sound came from, then I see it. The scythe-like limb emerging from a hole in the floorboards. How frightful. Sigurd frowned, placing another tankard of Siegbräu in front of Ash. The unkindled nodded his thanks before turning back to the assembled group. Quite so. Anyway, not that I haven't seen anything disturbing before. The lair of Aldrich was horrible. He grimaced, taking a swig of his drink. But I see the spider, big as I am, emerge from the hole. We stare at each other for what feels like an age. What did you do then? Sasaki asked, raising an eyebrow inquisitively, then gestured to the others at the table. Judging by their reactions, it must have been something grand. Ash paused, looking around to see Arash hiding his grin behind his own drink while Beatrice was far less reserved. Her smile plain as day as she made careful note not to look Ash in the eyes. Well, Ash coughed into his hand. There may have been a slight overreaction on my part. Slight. Sasaki queried, turning his head over to Arash when the archer snorted loudly. Well, it depends on your definition. Arash chuckled, we've been outside for a couple minutes at that point. Master was getting a little worried and we were getting close to sending someone else in after him. Raising a hand, he pointed towards Ash while chortling, then he comes barreling out, cursing at the top of his lungs. He spins around to face the building and throws the largest ball of fire you've ever seen. Tell him what he did next. Beatrice elbowed him, gleefully smiling at Ash's look of embarrassment. Right. Arash nodded his head, placing his cup down and gesturing with both his hands, so we all stood there, dumbfounded at what just happened. Then Ash, building still burning behind him, turns around to face us and in the calmest voice imaginable just says, we need to leave. Ha! Cu let out a bark of laughter, slamming his hand on the table while Sigurd openly chuckled at his fellow unkindled. Sasaki was far more reserved, but the curling of his lip upwards showcased his obvious amusement. I was surprised. Ash argued back with a small frown, I wasn't expecting it. To be fair. Arash's laughter died down, it was a bit less severe than Master's. Really? Cu raised an eyebrow, how bad? Turns out he has a fear of spiders. Cu snorted, shaking his head, well shit, bet that was fun for him. Beatrice nodded, I think he screamed louder than me. Then we met the Chaos Witch Quelaag. What was wrong with her? Think of a centaur but instead of a horse, it's a spider. Kid was shit out of luck then. The Lancer sighed, taking swig of his drink, did he get better? I'm not entirely sure. Ash replied, tapping his finger against the table, I don't believe he spoke with the Chaos Witch all that often. Verndari did though. Verndari spoke to her just to hurl insults. Arash pointed out with a frown, not that she was much better, think she enjoyed getting those reactions out of him. Then again, I heard that things got pretty heated between the two of you as well. Ash let out a low hum in response, that's more related to her family than to her. That and, well, it extends to Gwyndolin too. Isn't that the god we have running around? Cu raised an eyebrow in response, then blinked, speaking of which, where is he? I believe Astolfo took off to give him a tour. Sigurd responded, picking up the tray of empty glasses in front of the servants and moving back behind the counter. He apparently said that he's never met God before and a god of the moon felt like fate to him. Hey. Cu coughed, looking to Ash, can your gods curse people and shit? How do you think the original undead came about? Ash responded dryly, then again, Gale was my only source of information. He furrowed his brows, and Andre, funnily enough. Although he was strange. What do you mean? Andre was human. Ash frowned, at least, I believe he is. I never saw any brand on his skin, he shrugged, probably just managed to avoid contracting it. Make it sound like some kind of sickness. It was a completely random sickness. Ash replied, could strike anyone. Still, never did ask how old Andre was. You going too? I'm sure it's fine. Ash dismissed, probably doesn't matter too much. So you were talking about curses. Cu blinked. Ah, yes. If we've got that bundle of, whatever the fuck he is being our representative, what are the chances we somehow manage to piss them off? There was a brief pause when all the servants looked around at each other. Then they instantly rushed off their seats, panicked expressions on their faces as they took off out of the cafeteria in search of Astolfo and Gwyndolin. By the end of their exodus, only Arash and Sasaki remained at the table, both of whom looked entirely nonplussed by the apparently hazardous situation. Not joining them, the assassin asked, raising an eyebrow. Arash mulled over it for a few moments then shook his head in response, giving a carefree smile. Nah, I'm sure they're overestimating that situation. The archer replied, besides, Astolfo is a bundle of energy, and pretty clumsy. But he isn't exactly a detriment. He then raised his hand and tapped the side of his head, also, gesturing to his eyes. Sasaki gave him a knowing smile in response, of course. How silly of me. AAAAAAANNNNNDDDD. Astolfo threw open the final door, this is the kitchen. He exclaimed, thrusting Gwyndolin inside, in case you ever want to cook. He paused, staring at the person inside, Sigurd turned around, blinking at Astolfo and then Gwyndolin, Oh. Hello Astolfo. The knight smiled at him, nodding his head. I assume you are showing our new guest around. He turned his head to Gwendolyn, then straightened his expression and bowed his head respectfully. Lord Gwendolyn of Anorlando, god of the dark moon and captain of its knights. It is an honor to have you here. I am Sigward of the Knights of Katarina. Thou may rise. Gwendolyn gestured. Thy respect for decorum is noted. His helmet is his top half, although Sigward could feel as though the Lord's eyes briefly flickered over to Astolfo, and is a welcome change. I suppose. Sigward then tilted his head. If I may, Lord Gwendolyn, might I make a suggestion? Thee might. The others Here it is. The high-pitched voice called out from further in the kitchen. Sigward turned towards their direction and allowed himself a small smile. This is my conviction. I see. Sigward nodded his head. The teal-haired girl in the kimono approached him with a small plate, setting it gently on the counter. This is your Omuris, did you say? Indeed. She nodded, then sharpened her expression. Have I proven myself? One moment. He held up his hand. Astolfo, might I request your services? Yep. The pink-haired paladin rushed forwards. What can this cute knight do for you? If you could taste this for me. The girl blinked, then frowned at him. I am not a poisoner. I have no working taste buds, I am afraid. Sigward replied with a somewhat dejected expression. Any food you made me would be wasted. The girl's frown lessened. Yes. Yes, I suppose that is acceptable then. She eventually nodded, then turned around only to let out a slight eep when she found herself face to face with the golden-plated helmet of Gwendolyn. The Lord stared down at her, his lips drawn into a thin line. Thou art. Thee feels like a dragon. The girl flashed out her fan, covering the bottom half of her face and furrowing her brows. I am Kiyohime, I am of the dragon kin. I see. He leaned backwards. I am Gwendolyn. God of the dark moon. A divine spirit. She raised an eyebrow, then looked the god up and down. Her eyes resting on the small pale snakes which emerged from the base of his dress and stared up at her. They lingered on them for an extended period of time before they went back to his face. Well. It doesn't matter. What interest do you have in ancient Sama? Quote. To whom does thee refer to? Gwendolyn tilted his head. Sigward raised his hand and stepped forwards. That is her name for our master. The knight supplied, then winced and looked down at Kiyohime. Milady. Lord Gwendolyn is a prince. Oh. Kiyohime blinked, looking to Sigward in slight surprise before she slowly nodded her head, then turned back to Gwendolyn. Do you have a sexual interest in men? I beg thy pardon. Milady. Sigward let out a nervous chuckle, slowly turning her away from the Lord while sending an apologetic look his way. Milady. I do not believe Lord Gwendolyn has any interest in Master, in that way. I must be sure. With how wonderful Anshin Sama is, rivals are bound to be common. Yes. But I do not believe you need not concern yourself on this particular front. Sigward replied with a reassuring look. I very much doubt that Lord Gwendolyn is one of your rivals. Well, if you're sure, she muttered, snapping her fan shut and giving the god a beatific smile. The moon you say. I do not suppose I could have your blessing for the wedding ceremony. Milady, Sigward gave another nervous chuckle. I believe you may have skipped several steps. Thou art to be married to the mortal. Gwendolyn asked with confusion. They made no mention of this. It's Sigward paused as he tried to find the right words, a sudden announcement. Really sudden. Astolfo chimed in, like she suddenly arrived and said they were married, and by suddenly arrived I mean basically a few hours ago. I see. Gwendolyn tilted their head. Regardless. I shall await the mortal, who can direct me to my quarters. The god turned away from them, slowly slithering away, out of the kitchen and down the hall. I must say, I would never have expected that. Sigward let out a sigh of relief, then turned to Astolfo. You've got nearly everyone in a fuss tracking you down. Really? Astolfo blinked at him. Why? Because they were concerned that you would do something chaotic, I suppose. He shrugged. How is the food? Can I have seconds? No. Kiyohime replied instantly. It is for my Anshin Sama. Then looked to Sigward, opening up her fan in front of her mouth and raising an eyebrow at the knight-turned-cook. So. Well, if there is no issue in the cooking, then I see no reason to bar you. Sigward replied with small smile. While I would be happier to have more helpers on hand, I have no trouble if you wish to use the kitchen to prepare food for master. Kiyohime smiled at him. I knew you would see it my way. Indeed, it is perfectly normal for a wife to prepare her husband's meals. I've never been married so I wouldn't know. I've had people make food for me. Astolfo shrugged, then looked to Sigurd. So can I get some more food? I'm beginning to wonder if your lack of common sense is fueled purely by your stomach. Sigurd joked. Astolfo pouted in response. Are you saying I'm fat? I do not believe we can even change our physical shape. Sigurd responded, then cupped his chin. Unless, do you believe I could shave my mustache? I'd rather you didn't. Astolfo shook his head. Looks kind of funny, like someone's cool uncle or something. Why does the temperature of something matter? I really think we need to explain modern slang to you. Astolfo nodded his head. So that is what I shall do. This feels like a strange idea to me. Nonsense. Astolfo proclaimed with a manic grin. I'll have you speaking the modern language of people in no time. Well, Sigurd frowned for a few moments before he let out a small sigh and slumped his shoulders. His hesitant expression eventually morphed into a more relaxed one. If you are so sure, I suppose. It can't hurt that much. That's the spirit. He's not in here. Ash kicked open the door to the another room, earning a brief cry of surprise from Da Vinci and Ritsuka. He looked around the interior of the room for a few moments before he shook his head, stepping back out and calling down the hallway to the Irish Lancer, he's not in here either. Shit. Will someone explain why they felt the need to kick open the door to my workshop? Ash turned back around to find Da Vinci smiling at him. Although he was slightly confused as to how a smile such as that could hold a strange sense of malice to it. We're searching for Astolfo. He explained, still staring at the caster in slight confusion. Ritsuka raised an eyebrow at him in response. Why? He appears to have taken Gwyndolin on a tour of the facility. Ash replied. Okay, and this translates to you kicking doors in, how? Da Vinci's expression had slowly morphed into an understanding one, although there was still the hint of annoyance in her eyes from having her room barged into. Mr. Protagonista. She brought Ritsuka's attention back to her. Astolfo, our cute little paladin, is currently alone with a god. Right. Do you understand what I'm telling you? No, I'm not seeing the, oh. Ritsuka slowly paled. Oh crap. Searched the entire east side. CU came to a stop next to Ash. Haven't found any sign of them, although some of the staff said they saw Astolfo showing off the supply closets. Why? Why does he do anything? CU shrugged. Leaves the west side, and however many floors this place has to it. Well, it can't be that bad, right? Ritsuka asked. Sure, Astolfo is kind of eccentric, does whatever he wants, doesn't listen to people all that much. I feel as though you have answered your own question. Ash replied, then turned to the Lancer. Is there any word on Beatrice's search? Even if she did find them, I think she's a little hesitant to try and stop them. The Lancer replied with a sigh. Then again, the guy is a divine spirit. Ash hummed for a few moments, cupping his chin in thought before he snapped his fingers. Why not simply use Sif to track the Lord? CU opened his mouth to present a counter-argument, then paused and shrugged. I got nothing. May as well go for it. Great. Da Vinci clapped her hands together. If you've all got a nice little plan all lined up. Can you please get out of my workshop? Considering I have to try and fix the door you might have broken. Ash and CU looked at the door to her workshop, the metal having been dented inwards as the door had been violently pushed open. Ash looked up to see the metal had been ripped from the hinges and slowly frowned. What manner of door doesn't open sideways? It's supposed to open up. That sounds like a terrible complicated design. Ash responded with a frown. Is it some manner of gate? Ah, right. He coughed. I will be on my way. Apologies for the damages, if you need any help. Oh, don't worry. I'm sure I'll think of something. You're in deep shit. CU whispered to him as they departed. Deep shit. Really? Oh yeah. And we're back. So basically, the way the Chaldea chapters are going to work are a bit like fragments of Chaldea style, if you've read it, in that we'll get specific characters focused for the chapter with a little here and there bit of development. So, It's a matter of which character we're going to focus on for the next chapter, I suppose. We'll also get some character summoned in between. I've been thinking of calling the character stuff which takes place in between the main story, by the bonfire, which sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? Anyway, you might have been wondering where I have been. Worry no longer. I was away playing Elden Ring, love it.